Okay, we are recording, we are captioned, we are live for ourselves, not live for you, the viewer. Um, Unfortunately, thanks for joining us in our pre-recorded panel, Radically Reimagined, Open-Hearted Instruction Strategies for the Library Classroom. This is a panel we were really excited to bring to you live. It would be the first conference presentation for the three of us, all three of us at ACRL. And it was a real struggle. I think I'm speaking for Allison and Elisabeth to translate this to something recorded because we'd hoped to really feed off your energy and include your thoughts and voices in our panel as well. But we hope you enjoy this and take away some food for thought and for some strategies to bring into your classroom for the better. Yeah. So we're going to introduce ourselves now. And we're doing this a little bit differently. We're going to introduce ourselves as we would at this conference. And then we're also going to show you how we introduce ourselves to some students in the classroom. So this is my conference bio. My name is Bria Sinnott. I am the Arts and Communication Librarian at Towson University, which is located just outside Baltimore, Maryland. So I'm a liaison reference and instruction librarian for art and communication studies students. I was a late comer to education, not just as a field, but also as a student. I was an adult learner and a first generation student as well. And so that really informs what I do in the classroom and my life in general. And before librarianship, I had a career full of like a jack of all trades, Jill of none, right? So a master of none. And so yeah, this is a little bit about me. And then the next slide, you can see it's quite different. This is what I share with students. I do want them to know that I have a degree in library science. I think it's important that they know that work is required of us, but I want to come to them in the classroom as a person first and a scholar or a teacher second, or maybe even third or fourth, hopefully a partner. So I try to share little anecdotes about my life and make it fun and sort of easy to digest. This slide also usually comes along with a little synopsis of what I do. There's a lot of library stereotypes out there that I want to debunk. Some are lovely and precious and can stick around, others aren't. And I share what my typical workload looks like with students so that they can really see where they fit in. And I think that's helpful to let them know that helping them with their research is really my favorite part of the job and keeps me, as I tell them in the classroom, the more help I have to help give them, the less I have to do the stuff I don't really like doing. So I appreciate their emails.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our pre-recorded panel today. I'm Elisabeth White, and I also work at Towson University. So I work with Bria, and I miss having her just a few cubicles down from me so much during this pandemic. So I'm also a research and instruction librarian, and I work with the majority of the science and math departments at Towson. Like Bria, I have a lot of interesting work experiences from my past as well, but all of them really do inform the work that I do today. Whether that was working in a public library, having experience in a biomedical engineering lab, or tutoring math students, those all have lots of unique applications to my day-to-day work. And some of my fun hobbies are knitting, gaming, and going for walks. I really miss walking to work too. It's another pandemic related thing that has been a weird thing to adapt to for me. So here's how I introduce myself to my students. You can see that my headshot has turned into a Bitmoji, and that I really like to give students a good idea of, like what Bria said, what I actually do and the types of things that I can help students with. Whether I'm meeting with first year students or students in an upper level science class, I find that a lot of the time they really don't understand what the day-to-day work of a librarian is. So I think it's important to give students specific examples both at the beginning of my class sessions and throughout the session to let them know what types of questions they can ask me to make them feel more comfortable reaching out and understanding that, yes, this is an appropriate thing to ask a librarian to help you with.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Jennings-Roche, and I'm a reference and instruction librarian at the University of Baltimore. The University of Baltimore is a minority serving urban institution in the heart of downtown Baltimore. We're a smaller school than Towson University, so as a part of my job, I get to do a little bit of a lot of things. I'm the subject liaison to the business school. I teach a general education course on information literacy. I also do a lot of the civic engagement work with the library, intra-institutional partnerships, and I even do part-time data librarianship for a research center on campus. So, I really get to see all the pieces and I love what I do. I have a broad experience background in student affairs, public libraries, archives, academic library staff. I was a fitness instructor and a stay-at-home mom for a while. I've done a little bit of a lot of things along the same side. Educationally, I started out as a first gen, really impoverished student when I came to college. I was a McNair Scholar, which was a program that prepares, first gen, low income, and other minority students to go on to graduate school. I did it a little bit out of order. I first got a master's in legal studies and then had a bunch of kids. As I said, came back, just graduated with my MLIS in December 2019. Yay. And I will actually be starting my PhD in information studies at the University of Maryland in the fall. I'm super excited about that. And a big part of, my journey and the wandering is that I have 4 kids under the age of 9. I'm also a yoga teacher and knitter, and I like to rock climb and run, but I'm not good at either of those things, and that's okay. Yeah. So this is kind of my student-facing bio. And what I do a lot of the times when I introduce myself to students, I kind of, whether I'm working with graduate students, I work with a lot of graduate students. We have a lot of those at the University of Baltimore. We were traditionally an upper level institution with just the last 2 years of college and then graduate programs. I found when I had just the headshot of me, it was a little bit, people didn't engage as much. So what I started doing is I included this picture of me and my children from that MLIS graduation in 2019. And, I kind of use this to set up, like, I have done this. I have been, an adult learner. I have a family. I have a lot going on. I know to a certain extent what you're going through. And I like to point out even to my education and be like, I know a little bit about a lot of things. I have all this educational background and I'm a UBalt alum myself. So I can usually help you where you're going. And one of my favorite little plugs that everybody, if you've been in multiple classes, hears me say, like, look, I have 4 kids. Please jump in at any time. I'm happy to answer your questions and be interrupted. It happens to me all day, every day. So I just want to explain myself. So jump in. And I find this works.
That's great. Allison, they look so proud of you in that picture. I love that. It
It
really
was a good
shines through.
picture.
So we are going to be talking about bringing transparency and vulnerability into the classroom. So it will be helpful to get just a brief definition of what we're talking about, how we're viewing these sort of really soft skills, right? That can be hard to define. So this definition or this quote is an altered text from an article, an Inc. article, that was discussing radical transparency in a business context, right? So the value of being transparent to your public and to your employees. And I changed the language in this quote. What's italicized and in blue was words like company, employees, staff, and I've changed it here. So instead now it reads, radical transparency, as we're talking about it today, is really about creating a culture that is direct and honest in communication and sharing of library strategies so that all people are trusting and loyal to the continuous evolution of the organization. And so for librarians, radical transparency is a way to build trust with students.
Yeah, and so the other part of that radical transparency, right? We need that emotional foundation to be transparent, right? Transparency is all well and good if you're just sharing facts and figures. It can be put forward that way as very a documentarian thing. But we were grounding this in that social emotional context of vulnerability, and I think we all actually came together over our shared love of Brene Brown. So of course we included a quote in here. It's about it's uncertainty, it's risk, and it's emotional exposure. But, we also want to be clear that it's not about that oversharing or, putting our emotional concerns on our students or our colleagues, but it is knowing how sharing that much of our humanity with each other, with our students, with, the faculty we're working with, how that builds a much more solid foundation for continued conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking too, just to acknowledge, we're white women working in a field of predominantly white women. And so with that comes the privilege of being able to be more vulnerable, I think. And so this is our view of it. But I totally understand this is going to look different and for everyone. You're going to have different comfort points where you are bringing these into the classroom. So, be kind to yourself, I think is the bottom line, and only do what kind of feels good for you and makes you feel like a stronger, more effective teacher and librarian. But we really kind of started thinking about how many times we've heard in our lives at the reference desk, in a classroom, something prefaced with the phrase, I have a stupid question. I can think of maybe a dozen examples in my head. I can also think of a lot of times when I started a question with, this is stupid, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's arguably braver to ask the stupid question than it is to stay silent. But it got us thinking how many students are staying silent, aren't coming forward, aren't brave enough or trusting enough of their librarians and their teachers to ask the big questions they need to make sense of what we're saying, make sense of the world, and hold us accountable for what we're saying, right? So we're going to ask a couple big, stupid questions and use that as sort of a jumping off point of talking about these big, soft, squishy topics. And hopefully along the way, you think of some things and share what you're thinking of or comments that come up for you in our virtual chat space. I'm always surprised, even though I've seen the slides in advance, I see one and I'm like, oh yes, it's this. Like, okay. Our first big, squishy, stupid question is, how do you build trust with students? And I'm going to say just a little bit, but then I'm going to pass it off to Elisabeth, and Allison will add what she wants, and we'll sort of discuss it together. So when I think about trust with students and talking about trust, which is really like vulnerability in action, I think about this analogy that Brene Brown has used in a couple of her speeches. I think most recently in like a 2015 Super Soul presentation. She talked about building trust as like adding marbles to a jar, right? And that trust is not grand gestures. It's small, sliding door moments was the phrasing I think she used in that speech. And so it's how we're interacting with students at the reference desk, how we're interacting with them in the classroom, when we stumble upon them in the halls or virtual chat. It's all these teeny tiny little moments that we're letting students know it's okay that you're here. It's okay that you're asking something. And I'm truly here to help, right? But the we here, the trust building entity, is not us as individuals, right? I'm curious to hear what you guys think about this too, is we're representing the library. So we can have very trusting, open, helpful interactions. But if they have an interaction with a librarian or someone they perceive as a librarian that doesn't feel so welcoming, marbles are coming out of the jar, right? And so it's only when that jar is full that a student is really going to feel comfortable asking us those harder questions.
Mhm.
Yeah, so for me, a lot of the trust comes from just bringing my whole self into the classroom and really helping students to relate to me, since if they can understand where I'm coming from, then hopefully they will feel more comfortable reaching out for help in the moment during the class or even after reaching out for help as they're more at the point of need working on their assignments. So with a lot of that, I just like to show up, keep things as lighthearted as I can to begin with, maybe tell a silly joke or two, and make it really clear to students that I don't take myself that seriously, and so they shouldn't either. And I think that can really help start building the rapport right away. And another key component of trust that I bring into my instruction is being honest if I don't know the answer to something and about the limits of my expertise. So I'll explain what my educational background is. So if I'm working with a class of biology students, it's great that I can tell them I majored in biochemistry when I was an undergrad as well. So I have some level of experience with what you're doing. I understand what issues you might encounter and that sort of thing. but I don't have the same level of content knowledge that your faculty member would have. So you can reach out to me for questions about research, and I can really help with that. But for more like conceptual questions related to the content of the course outside of your research, that's something where the faculty really is the expert there, and you should reach out to them for assistance instead. And sometimes in classes, a student might ask a question and I don't know the answer. So in that case, I like to use that as a teachable moment and say, you know what, I'm not sure, but here is how I might try to find the answer to that. Or I might experiment with it live there. So maybe I'll show them, you know what, this is something where I would just Google it. And then I will bring up Google on my browser and we'll see how that goes, just so they can see. Like, I may be the person at the front of the classroom or who's the host in their Zoom room in this current environment, but that doesn't mean that I'm the expert. So I think that that really helps build trust too. What do you think, Allison?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all of these pieces, right? I think it's about showing up and sharing who we are, right? Sharing that I am a parent, and I might not email you back at 9 p.m. Give me some grace, and I'll give you some grace too, right? I think it's so much about modeling the limits of our expertise as well, and admitting when we don't know the answer. I think that is huge pieces of that. And I think the idea of trust is different depending on the interaction, right? In a classroom, I'm going to share, I'm an alum of the school. I'm a first gen. I grew up in Baltimore City, lots of things that connect with lots of students. Um, but I'm not going to share as much about myself. Just last week, I had a meeting with a student who was struggling with a paper, and she was like, "Oh, well, you wouldn't know. You've been so successful all the way through your career." And I was like, "Oh, no. Oh, no. I, at one point in my life, was academically suspended, right? I got depressed and I just stopped doing my work. And I came back and I'm here to help you now, right? So that's not something that I'm going to share in front of, all the faculty in front of a classroom. But when a student is in a position that they don't know whether or not they can trust me, if they're feeling shame about where they are, at this point in my life, I felt a lot of shame about that for a very long time. But at this point, I just view it as an asset, right? And ability to be like, nope, I'm human too. I've struggled with this, right? It's all of those little pieces and knowing what to bring in when and in what context. And for me, ultimately, I feel like every interaction I have with the student, I worry less about getting them the right answer. I know, bad librarian, right? Um, I'm way more concerned about how they feel about that interaction when they walk away. Do I feel like they're going to come back and ask me follow-up questions? Or, like that's all that matters. I just care about in my instruction and in my one-on-ones. Like, do they feel good? Do they feel supported? Do they feel listened to? Because then they'll come back, right? And if they don't, then they won't. It doesn't matter how good my information was if I wasn't able to, really provide that space socially and emotionally for students.
Yeah, I
I
think you
love
bring up
that.
a really good point about the limits of transparency there. Just in general, I'm an open book. I'm comfortable sharing most aspects of myself with anyone, but at the same time, there are situations where it is appropriate to share certain things and where it is not. So I find it's a lot easier to share those more vulnerable moments with students when you're meeting with them one-on-one, and it's just you and the student, and you're having that authentic interaction. But when you have a full classroom of students and there's a faculty member there, you have to take that into consideration as well. So something
Mhm.
that I always keep in the back of my mind is, okay, I need to rein it in a little bit because I don't want to undermine my authority. And I
Yep.
also don't want to say anything that's going to undermine the authority of their faculty member. So there might be situations where something isn't going super well because maybe I didn't have a lot of details from the faculty member about who was in this class, where they're at in the research process, what they really need to know. So I'm just kind of using my best guess based on the limited details I was able to get. That's not something I'm going to express to the student, though, because that is going to influence their view of their professor, and that's not a dynamic that we need to get into. That could definitely
Right.
cause some negative impacts on our experience. So there are some things that definitely are affecting us, but that doesn't mean that it's always appropriate to share. So finding that balance can be tricky.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. Like trust building is a process, not a product, right? Like
Hmm.
we're never going to stop building and maintaining trust with the people we interact with. Um, again, Queen Brene, I know she outlined this. There's some acronym for trust building, which I'm not going to rehash now, but what I'm hearing from both of you really is one of those aspects of non-judgment, right? Like you can ask me for what you need, and I'm going to ask you what I need from you, and together with that understanding, we're going to be able to move forward
Absolutely.
productively. Yeah. Should we hit our next big question? It's a surprise. Ooh, who is really in charge in your classroom? Just think about that. Sit with that. Elisabeth, I want you to start us off here. Allison, lend us your voice, and if I have anything to add.
Sure. So this, just like the last question, is very much not a stupid question at all. It's surprisingly difficult to answer, even though it may seem simple on the surface. So I think of this from the student perspective. When they walk into a library classroom or a Zoom room, a lot of times at the beginning of the session, they might think, oh, well, the faculty member is in charge because they're my professor. They're the one who's grading things. But then once we start to get to know each other and we're building that rapport and they're seeing what this classroom dynamic is, I think by the end of the session, a lot of the time students might think like, oh, okay, this was a librarian-led session. She's the teacher here now. This is different than our normal interaction. And sometimes I feel that we might go a little bit too far in that direction based on questions I get from students afterwards where they're asking me things like, oh, like how many sources do I need for this assignment? Or just details that their professor should be the one answering, so they kind of forget who really created the assignment and who's grading it sometimes. But what I would really like to say in response to this question is that students ultimately are in charge of the classroom. I like to give them as much autonomy as possible because they really are in charge of their educational outcomes. We're there to guide them along that journey. I believe in any classroom of students I have, my students all have the innate capability to be successful researchers. It's just up to me to give them the tools that they need to be successful. So in that sense, I'm in charge since I'm leading the way, letting them know what resources are out there, how to use them effectively, and trying to encourage that critical thinking. But at the same time, they're the ones who are going to be applying those skills, so they should really be in charge in that respect. Allison, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, forgive the intrusion of the little visitor here in
Not
the spirit
needed.
of vulnerability. I was like, "Oh God, I'm really glad I was muted in that moment." So who's in charge of the classroom? I think that's such an interesting thing, right? I have a very natural inclination to disregard all authority to a certain extent, right? Like I think we're all equal here in whatever setting that is, and then that's a really hard thing to navigate in a classroom. Right. And so I'm constantly trying to draw out the students and get them to talk to me. I also try to be really clear, when I get a question, throughout it, be like, I don't know, Professor so and so, what do you think? I do a lot of that, and I try not to do instruction sessions without the other faculty members there, especially because a lot of what I do is business research assignments, which is not my background. And what the faculty want from that is so specific that it's not the same thing as like a historical research paper or something that I have done in my educational context, right? Um, so I try to just really share power, share autonomy, and really listen. I've definitely had students explain things to me and the rest of the class in the middle of an assignment. I'm very much a bell hooks devotee of like we're all in this shared space and this shared understanding of what's happening. But I have to acknowledge, right? I do have a level of institutional power, but with that, I have this institutional responsibility in a Spider-Man sense, right? To hold the safe space for all of the other students. Because as much as I want to say, like, oh, the students are empowered or they're in charge here, at a certain level, it's on me to maintain the structure of the class of the assignment and to make sure that everyone can safely communicate in that setting, which you wouldn't think that finance research sessions can get sticky, but everything can, right? So
Oh,
I try
everything.
not to give away so much power that I'm not able to show up for other people at any given time. What do you think, Bria?
Such a balance. I love what you're both saying is that students have that degree of control in the classroom and their mood, right? Like can so dictate how successful a class is going to be. If you've got student buy-in to what you're saying, um, yeah, but we have to share the power, right? So, how does that work in a way that benefits everybody? Like Elisabeth, I'm always the first to admit that I'm not an expert on the subject they're researching, and instead present a different view of authority. Like, no, I don't know a lot about organizational communication. Honestly, when I took this class, I had to withdraw and take it again because things weren't going well, as an undergrad. So, but I'll say, but what I do have experience in is this assignment. I've been in this class for 3, 4, 5 semesters. I've worked with students on this assignment. I know what kind of trouble they have. So, your emerging expertise and my knowledge of the pitfalls of this assignment and how we can navigate around them are a very powerful team. And if you view me as a partner, if we can share it in that way, hopefully the outcome is a successful one. But we're always visitors in classrooms, right? Like very rarely do we have one course, one syllabus all to ourselves to control. So we're really at the mercy of not just the students, but the instructors. And now, like, where we're meeting, right? Like, I'm in Zoom rooms, I'm in WebEx rooms, I'm meeting and collaborate. And so it takes away a lot of autonomy of how we can plan our instruction. But the one
I
thing
mean,
that's always constant is like the student, right? So ask the student, what do you want to see? How do you want me to show this to you? And what questions do you have? And let's just go from there. Yeah. Were you going
mhm.
to say something, Allison?
Oh no, I was just gonna say I have the, the great opportunity and privilege to even teach a credit bearing course, right? I teach a 3 credit gen ed, but in that context, it's a general education requirement, right? Like no one really has full autonomy because I'm meeting the needs of, this institutional context and what needs to be done. I have to meet the learning outcomes and requirements of the course. So I think sometimes even acknowledging that level of power to students can be useful no matter how much we're maybe in charge or not in charge of any one assignment or classroom, right? We're all a part of these much larger institutional structures and accreditation and all of these other pieces that come into play in all of these
Yep.
interactions.
Yep. There are stakeholders we don't even see that we don't
Mhm.
understand.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
Bria, I like how you phrased it as we're partners with the students, but also with the faculty members. And with this question of who's really in charge, I feel like every session really feels different in response to that, depending on what the class's dynamic is with that faculty member and how involved that faculty member is in the session. So there are some sessions where the faculty member comes in, they might briefly introduce me, or they might not introduce me at all, and they'll just expect me to get started. And, they might sit in the back of the classroom silently or turn their video off on Zoom or what have you, and then really I just have free reign and that's what's happening. But in other situations, the faculty member is a lot more involved and in addition to responding, if I'm like, hey, that's a great question, Professor so and so, how would you respond to that student? Sometimes they will also independently say, like, oh, yeah, that's a good point that your librarian just made. And they'll reiterate what I said or to emphasize the importance, or maybe they'll have something additional to add on that I didn't mention. And I find that those sessions are really the most productive. So when we can kind of balance these power dynamics and give students some autonomy to control their own destinies here, while having involved faculty members who can emphasize the importance to students since they have that extra power, since they're the ones who will be assessing the student work, while also giving us the authority to draw upon our expertise as librarians. That's when we can really have the best sessions for everyone.
Yeah, agree. It's every life is just a choose your own adventure book, right? We get to the end one way or another, but yeah. What's our next big squishy question here? Whew. What do we gain as librarians, as humans, by staying behind the curtain? Allison, I want you to kick us off with this question.
Yeah, so personally, right, I feel like this is so much of what I really enjoy and what I feel really privileged to be able to do as a librarian, right? I feel like so much of my role is really just pulling back that curtain. As I said before, the idea that there are accreditation standards, there's general education requirements, there are requirements for whatever courses, right? Um, those things and that ability to explain and have these really real and honest conversations with students, like, you're doing this assignment this way because, right, when those conversations come up, feel like an opportunity to me. And speaking as someone who came to education as a first-gen low-income student, I didn't understand these larger institutional contexts for a really long time. So I'm grateful that I'm able to do that. And I also think parts of that, even aside from this classroom stuff, but explaining, right? When I explain, interlibrary loan, I say, it's included. I don't say it's free because it's not free. Nothing in life is free. And I talk about the labor of the people that are doing it. Or when I'm explaining even how to search a database, right? I'm explaining the labor that's going in the metadata creation and in the catalogers and how all of these things are happening behind the scenes, whether it's a library catalog or even, a publicly available search engine, right? I think so much of the labor that happens in information work is invisible, and therefore students both don't understand the value of the humans doing that work, right? Not through any fault of their own, but they also kind of don't get that there's humans doing this work, right? And that it's not all machine created, whether that's a library context, a search engine's context, or even, like, oh, well, my professor's making me write this research paper and I don't want to, and this doesn't make sense. It's like, yeah, but it's required you write this many research assignments to graduate, right? Like, all of those pieces, I think, are one of the most valuable things we can offer because we really exist in that liminal space on campus, right? We're not quite support staff. We're not, quite the exact same thing as instructional faculty, but we can navigate those spaces pretty well and assist, the students and even, like the public, the patrons, whoever we're working with at any given time, helping to pull back that curtain. So my big thing is I don't think there's any such thing as library magic, right? There was just a great piece of scholarship published on this. I think it's all about acknowledging the very real work done by ourselves, done by our colleagues, and done by, people we don't know very much behind the scene. And I think that that is just so valuable for all of us. What do you think, Bria?
Yeah, you take for granted what you don't know is there, right? I mean, you were talking and I was thinking of all those years my parents were stuffing the Christmas stockings and I was giving all the credit to the guy with the right beard, right? But you also, without knowing how things work, you can't question it. And so I know the three of us, we feel pretty strongly about information should be free, open access, and accessibility for all. And we can't make those changes as single individuals. So if you share the faults in the systems, right? Like I know Elizabeth and I at our university, we were undergoing a journal cancellation project. So it was on our mind this amount that we were currently spending on journal subscriptions, and I couldn't help myself but share that number in the classroom, and students were enraged. They didn't understand how it could be so much money, and whose fault is that they don't understand that access to this information costs millions of dollars, right? Like, whose fault is that? And so, how is it ever going to change if there's not a generation of adults, young adults, questioning this and pushing back? And so, you get rid of the curtain, for the benefit, right? That nobody benefits from keeping the secrets of these invisible processes, I think. And yeah, part of that transparency in really simple ways in your classroom is sharing your job description, is sharing the hidden cost of things. And I love that language of, it's included and you are paying for this already, whether you use it or not. So use it. Yeah. Elizabeth, I know, are you still sharing those big numbers in the classroom?
I do sometimes, yeah. So when I saw this behind the curtain question, my mind also really went to like publication and how the academic publishing structure works and what the disadvantages are of that, because that's something that I do work into my instruction. So in probably the majority of the classes that I teach, I'm asked to do some method of teaching students how to literature search. So while that's a thing that I have to have them do, at the same time, I don't want to just focus on like, oh, here's why professors are having you use these resources because academic journal articles are really great. I'll explain the benefits of them and why this is an accepted structure, but I do like to present that alongside the disadvantages of academic publication. So these issues that we have related to publication costs and access issues and all of those as well as flaws with the peer review process. And this is something that's actually easier for me to get faculty buy-in for than some other things, because a lot of times they will ask me to cover predatory journals, since that's a big issue in the sciences. So right there, I often have the opportunity, based on what the faculty member is asking me to do, to talk about some of these issues and how poorly thought out studies can be published, and why all of these problems exist and things that they need to be aware of. Because I think it's important to articulate this to students, because I hope that some of my students do go on to be researchers and publish their own work someday. So I hope that they consider all of these issues when they are making decisions about where to publish their own work. So whether a faculty member requests it or not, I do always pay some attention to that. I rarely have as much time as I would like to in a one-shot session to talk about those issues, but getting students to think critically and challenge these existing structures, even if they have to use them within the confines of their instruction, is important, because I am afraid a lot of times they're not getting that information elsewhere.
You're right. Yeah, let's see our next big question. Oh, when was the last time you failed, and what did that moment give you? I'll start us off here. And we do want to be cognizant of time too, ladies. We're on a roll here. Yeah, I love failure. I try to fail often. It's part of the process. It's definitely a part of research. My God, like all the good research questions came out of failed experiments, failure. Um, you know, I think the last time I failed was pretty intentional. I went into a first year seminar class and I demonstrated a search, and we're supposed to deliver so much information to these first year students in so little time. And I just demonstrated complete failure. I never even got to where a good place. And my whole point in that exercise was intentional and was to say, hey, like I have practice, I have a degree in this, I have knowledge, and I could not sit down and do this in 2 minutes, and neither can you. You know, it's a process, and failure is part of the process. So, what it gave me was it freed me from all the time I spend trying to put these perfect canned searches together. And what I hope it gave the students was a permission to mess up and learn from it and not walk away, and hopefully to build in the time they need to get this work done. Um, yeah, like Elisabeth, are you failing regularly in the classroom?
So I had a hard time with this question because I don't really view many things as a failure at all. So sometimes a session won't go the way I intended, something weird happens, I have a technical issue, maybe I'm not getting the students to interact as much as I would like, but I don't see any of those experiences as failures, because there was still something positive we can draw from that. Maybe it's me reflecting on what went wrong and why, so I can correct that later. Or maybe it's another like teachable moment, as we've talked about in other contexts as well. So if I'm doing a search that doesn't work in the middle of a class session, I can talk through my thought process there, and as I'm reacting to it and thinking, okay, why didn't that work? And then I might realize something silly like, oh, I misspelled that. That brings up a really good point for all of you to know. Databases may not correct your misspelling, so that's something you should always double check. So I don't view any of these really as failures, just opportunities for growth for myself and for the students.
So wise. So wise. Anything to add, Allison?
Yeah, so I actually think I had a hard time with this one in a little bit in the same way Elisabeth did, because I rarely view things as failures in the sense that I tried to hold myself in self-compassion, right? I think a level of self-compassion is essential for us to allow that grace to other people. Although I think everyone who's watching this now just saw my failure, right? I had everything perfectly set up for the children to not interrupt me to do this recording, and there's still a screaming 3-year-old in the corner of my recording, right? And that the level of panic there, right? Or I've, technical glitches galore throughout the pandemic, or because I use a lot of business research, right? And that's not where I came from. I'm learning a lot, but I'll mispronounce, an acronym or something. And it's these little moments that I'm like, oh, that feels bad. But I try to have compassion for that and realize, I'm just growing, I'm just learning, and my students, my colleagues, the faculty, everybody's learning and growing alongside of us. And I think honestly, forgiving myself is the best practice possible for me to be able to hold that space for other people. Because I think I'm hardest on myself. I think we all are, right? So working on that is what it gives me the most, I think.
Yeah, model that self-compassion. That's really beautiful. Um, what do you need? I think for the sake of time, we're not going to tell you what we need, right? Like, but we want to hear what you need. Yeah, to make this work in your classroom, either
Yeah,
permission
what
from
could we
yourself
all
or,
do to
yeah.
support each other just as a broader community of practice here to encourage you to share the parts of yourself and the parts of these systems and everything we've talked about today? Like, how can we support you in your quest to be more vulnerable and transparent for your students? So we encourage you to add any of those thoughts into our chat space here, and we look forward to reading and commenting on those.
And for the sake of transparency, that question was taken from Tressie McMillan Cottom and Roxanne Gay's podcast, Here to Slay. They do that at the end of every episode. And I always think that that's so beautiful and so useful as we support each other in this journey, in whatever journey we're on.
So we began with some Brene Brown, and we'd like to leave you with Brene's words once again. So we have a quote on the screen here. How would education be different if students, teachers, and parents sat on the same side of the table? Thank you for your contributions. Here's how you're making a difference. What ideas do you have moving forward? So we would love for all of you to ponder that, reflect, and if it inspires you, please add any thoughts that you have into our chat space. So thank you all again for coming and watching this pre-recorded panel. We know there were many different ways that you could spend your day, and we are just delighted that you chose to spend some of it with us. So once again, we encourage you to reach out to us in the chat space, email us if there's anything that any of us said that really resonates with you, and we really look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, love to make new friends, new connections, and we're all library workers, I assume, in this space. So look us up, track us down. We're happy to chat. I'm so thrilled with all of the wonderful connections I've made with people like Bria and Elisabeth. So thank you.
Yes, thanks for your time and enjoy the rest of your conference.